"Ma'am, you might want to step back from that door." The CEO turned slowly, irritation already sharpening her voice. The night security guard standing beside the control corridor looked like any other worker in the tower. Plain uniform, worn boots, tired eyes. Executives behind her chuckled, assuming the warning was some awkward attempt at authority from someone far below their world. "You do realize whose building this is, right?" she said, loud enough for the engineers and assistants crowding the hallway to hear. A few people smirked. Someone whispered something about janitors giving executive instructions. The guard didn't react. He only watched the glowing access panel beside the reinforced server door, the red diagnostic light blinking in a pattern nobody else seemed to notice. "Ma'am," he said again, calm, steady, almost gentle, "the system migration isn't stable yet. You really should step back. By the way, where are you watching from? Tell me in the comments below." Most of the executives rolled their eyes. To them, the scene was simple, a low-level employee trying to interrupt a multi-million-dollar system upgrade demonstration led by the most powerful woman in the company. What they didn't see was the way the guard's attention stayed fixed on that blinking red light, like a storm warning no one else could read. "Relax," the CEO said, waving a dismissive hand toward the biometric scanner. "It's a controlled test. The engineers know what they're doing." The guard inhaled slowly. The hallway smelled faintly of new carpet, polished glass, and expensive cologne, but underneath it all he could almost feel the network trembling, like machinery preparing to fail. And when the CEO lifted her hand to trigger the override command, he spoke once more. "You might want to step back." The hallway fell quiet for a second. Then someone laughed. The man didn't argue after that, didn't raise his voice, didn't try to prove anything. The quiet guard simply stood where he was, shoulders relaxed, eyes steady, as if he had already accepted what everyone else believed about him. His name was Marcus Hale. Most people in the tower knew him only as the night security officer who worked the quieter floors after sunset. The single dad who sometimes brought his daughter to the lobby after school because childcare ran late. They saw a patient man with tired eyes and careful movements. Someone who carried coffee in a dented travel mug and fixed squeaky doors before anyone noticed. What they didn't see was the way his gaze tracked the system diagnostics scrolling across the wall monitors. Lines of code flashed there, encryption warnings, access conflicts, security nodes arguing with each other deep inside the building's digital spine. To the engineers, those alerts looked like routine migration noise. To him, they sounded like alarms screaming underwater. Somewhere above them, elevators hummed. Somewhere below them, server turbines whispered through cooling pipes. The entire skyscraper breathed through its machines, and Marcus felt every nervous tremor. Because years earlier, long before anyone here had seen him in a security uniform, he had helped design systems that behaved exactly like this. Systems that locked down when something dangerous began spreading through the network. Systems that ignored executive authority once the fail-safe threshold was crossed. The red light beside the door blinked again. Once. Twice. 3 times. Marcus felt the moment arrive the way a pilot feels turbulence seconds before passengers notice. Behind him, the executives kept laughing, still entertained by the idea that a guard thought he understood the tower's technology. The CEO's fingers touched the override panel. A soft electronic chime sounded. And somewhere deep inside the building, a security protocol woke up. Marcus exhaled. The man didn't move toward the door, didn't try to stop her hand. He only watched the red light switch suddenly to solid. Down the hallway, a heavy metallic thud echoed. Another followed. Then another. Reinforced security doors were slamming shut across the entire tower. Conversation stopped. Laughter vanished. Someone muttered, confused. What the hell was that? Marcus already knew, and as the emergency lights flickered once overhead, he quietly whispered the words no one there was ready to hear. The lockdown just started. A ripple of confusion spread through the corridor as engineers glanced at their tablets, expecting the alerts to clear. Instead, the screens filled with warnings, cascading errors, and access denials none of them had seen before. The CEO turned back toward the security guard, irritation slowly fading into uncertainty. Marcus met her stare without anger, only quiet certainty. "Ma'am," he said softly, "now you really need to step back from that door." Somewhere above them, steel bolts sealed another corridor. Footsteps hurried. Radios crackled alive. The tower was turning into a cage, and the only man who seemed prepared for it was the guard. The CEO stared at him, the irritation in her face tightening into disbelief as another heavy metallic slam echoed somewhere down the corridor. "What lockdown?" Evelyn Cross demanded. Around her, the engineers were already tapping frantically on their tablets. Screens filled with red alerts reflected off the polished glass walls of the executive server hallway. One of the technicians swallowed hard. "Ma'am, several security nodes just sealed." Another door thudded shut somewhere on the floor above them. The vibration rolled through the concrete structure like distant thunder. "That's impossible," Evelyn snapped. This was a software migration test. The guard didn't raise his voice. He simply glanced once more at the solid red light glowing beside the server door. "The system doesn't think it's a test," he said quietly. A nervous laugh escaped one of the executives standing behind her. "Oh, come on," the man scoffed. "The night guard suddenly understands enterprise network architecture?" The hallway filled with uneasy chuckles. Evelyn folded her arms, looking Marcus up and down as if examining a piece of furniture that had started speaking. "Your security," she said flatly. "Your job is to watch doors, not explain how my company's infrastructure works." The tower hummed around them. Ventilation turbines spun harder now, pushing cool air through the server floor beneath their feet. Somewhere in the building an alarm chirped briefly, then died. The engineers kept typing. Nothing changed. Another technician looked up, his face pale. "Override commands aren't responding." "Then reroute them," Evelyn said sharply. "We are." More keystrokes, more red warnings, the same result. Marcus watched quietly from the side of the corridor, his expression calm in a way that made Daniel Ortega uneasy. The facilities manager had worked in buildings his entire life. He knew the difference between someone guessing and someone recognizing something dangerous. Marcus wasn't guessing. "What's happening?" One of the junior executives whispered. Daniel looked toward the guard again. The man was studying the monitor wall like someone reading a language he understood better than anyone else here. On the screens, the building's security map flashed with growing clusters of red. Sector locks, access denials, door seals. Marcus spoke again, still calm. The system detected conflicting authentication signals during the migration. One of the engineers frowned. "That shouldn't cause lockdown. It does if the system thinks someone's trying to override it during instability." The technician blinked. "How would you?" The man stopped mid-sentence. Because the guard had already turned his attention back to the screens. Quietly following the cascade, Evelyn's patience finally snapped. "Enough," she said sharply. "Security, step back." Marcus didn't move. "I am security." A few people laughed again, but the sound felt weaker now. The CEO stepped closer to the control panel, irritation sharpening every word. "You're interfering with a technical operation you clearly don't understand. Another alarm chirped from a distant floor. Then a voice crackled over a radio somewhere down the hallway. "Control, we've got doors sealing on 32. Someone cursed. Another engineer's tablet beeped loudly. "Ma'am, what?" "There are people stuck in restricted corridors." The hallway grew quieter. Evelyn's eyes flicked toward the screens where the security map now showed half a dozen red zones blinking across different floors. How many? Still counting. Marcus shifted slightly. The movement drew her attention again. "You," she said, pointing at him, "stop hovering around the control station." He tilted his head slightly, almost curious. "I'm not hovering. You're standing in the middle of a situation you're not qualified to comment on." He considered that for a moment. Then he gestured toward the wall display. "Sector 15 is about to seal too." An engineer frowned at his tablet. "Wait, he's right." The technician looked up, startled. "How did you?" The floor vibrated again as another reinforced door slammed shut somewhere above them. A few executives exchanged worried looks now. The joke was starting to wear thin. Marcus spoke again. "Once the fail-safe threshold activates, the system prioritizes containment." Daniel Ortega turned toward him slowly. "Containment of what?" The guard met his eyes. "Anything that might spread through the network." One of the engineers rubbed his temples. "Okay, that doesn't make sense. The architecture shouldn't behave like that." Marcus didn't argue. He simply looked back at the glowing screens. "That depends on how it was designed." Evelyn Cross exhaled sharply. "Enough speculation. I want this fixed now." The engineers resumed typing furiously. Commands fired into the system. Overrides attempted. Security privileges escalated. Every command returned the same result. Access denied. Across the hallway, a television monitor switched to the building's internal camera feeds. One feed showed an executive lounge. Another showed an empty hallway. A third showed something else. A teenager standing behind a sealed glass security door, confused, holding a phone that had clearly lost signal. The boy tapped the glass. A security officer on the other side shook his head helplessly. One of the assistants gasped softly. "That's Adrian." The CEO turned toward the screen. Her son stared back from the other side of reinforced glass. For the first time since the alarms began, the irritation drained from her face. Marcus watched the screen too. Then he spoke, almost gently. The system sealed the executive wing. The engineers looked at the map again. Red lights blinking everywhere now. And somewhere deep inside the tower, another security door slammed shut. If you're enjoying stories where quiet people prove everyone wrong, subscribe to the channel right now. Because this moment, it's only the beginning. Evelyn Cross turned slowly back toward the guard. "What did you do?" The question hung in the corridor like a spark waiting for fuel. Marcus didn't answer immediately. The red emergency glow from the wall monitors painted the hallway in sharp shadows, reflecting off glass and polished steel. Around them, engineers continued hammering at their consoles, fingers flying across touchscreens that stubbornly refused to cooperate. "I didn't do anything," he said at last. One of the senior engineers scoffed without looking up. "Right. And the building just decided to imprison half the executive floor on its own." The guard's eyes moved calmly across the security map filling the display wall. More red indicators had appeared since the last time he checked. Sector 19, 23, 32, each blinking slowly like warning beacons spreading across the tower. Daniel Ortega stepped closer, lowering his voice. "You saw this coming." Marcus tilted his head slightly. "I saw the signs." "What signs?" Another engineer snapped. "Because we've been monitoring this migration for 6 months, Marcus nodded toward the monitor where system logs were cascading down the screen. "Those handshake failures." The technician frowned. That's normal traffic during a migration. Not when they repeat in that pattern. The engineer hesitated. Marcus stepped forward just enough to point at a specific line of code flashing past. See the authentication loop? The system thinks two command sources are fighting for control. Daniel frowned. That would trigger defensive protocols. Marcus gave a small nod. Exactly. Across the hall, the television screen still showed the CEO's son behind the sealed glass door. Adrian Cross paced nervously now, tapping the barrier and glancing down the empty corridor behind him. A young assistant whispered, "He's stuck." Evelyn Cross didn't respond. Her eyes were fixed on the screens displaying the security network. The tension in her posture had shifted. The arrogance hadn't disappeared entirely, but something sharper had replaced it. Control, or the sudden lack of it. One of the engineers cursed under his breath. Why won't the override register? Another tapped his tablet harder. It's rejecting executive access. That's not possible, Evelyn said sharply. This system answers to me, Marcus spoke quietly. Not once containment mode starts, every head turned toward him. The guard stood exactly where he had been since the alarms began, hands loosely folded in front of him. Evelyn crossed the hallway in 2 quick steps. And how exactly would you know that? Marcus held her gaze. Because systems like this are designed to protect themselves from human mistakes, the hallway went silent again. Somewhere above them, a muffled alarm beeped 3 times, then stopped. One of the engineers leaned closer to his monitor, his face draining of color. "Oh, that's bad. What?" Evelyn demanded. The system just sealed the elevator shafts between floors 20 and 40. Daniel swore quietly. That means nobody can move vertically. Marcus nodded slightly. Containment spreads floor by floor once the system decides it's under attack. Another technician looked at him sharply. Attack? Nobody attacked anything. Marcus didn't argue. He simply gestured toward the screen again. Look at the command conflict logs. The engineer followed his finger. 2 authorization signals were flashing repeatedly. One from the migration server. One from the executive override panel Evelyn had triggered minutes earlier. The system was interpreting the clash as a breach attempt. A defensive lockdown. The technician's voice dropped. Wait, if the system thinks someone is forcing access, it shuts the building down, Marcus finished calmly. Evelyn's jaw tightened. Then shut it off. The engineer looked at her helplessly. We can't. Why not? Because the core server room sealed itself. Marcus added quietly, and the system doesn't accept shutdown commands during containment. The CEO turned sharply toward him again. You seem very confident about that. The guard shrugged slightly. I've seen similar protocols. Another metallic slam echoed faintly through the tower. A second later, radios crackled again. Control, this is security on 32. We've got more sealed corridors up here. Panic began creeping into the voices on the radio channel. Daniel rubbed his forehead. This building's turning into a maze. Marcus watched the monitors carefully. The containment map was spreading exactly as he feared. Another node blinked red. Sector 28. More people trapped. More access denied. The young assistant near the television whispered again. Adrian's trying to call someone. On the screen, the boy lifted his phone, staring at the dead signal bars. Evelyn's expression hardened. Fix this. Her voice wasn't loud. But it carried absolute authority. The engineers tried again. Commands fired. Firewalls rerouted. Emergency permissions activated. Every attempt bounced back. Access denied. One of the technicians slumped back slightly. This shouldn't happen unless... He stopped himself. Marcus finished the thought quietly. unless the system was designed to ignore executive authority once the threat threshold is crossed. The engineer looked at him slowly. Daniel did too. So whoever built this thing, the facilities manager said carefully, expected human interference during emergencies. Marcus didn't respond. Instead, he stepped closer to the screen, studying the system heartbeat scrolling across the logs. The pattern was accelerating, which meant the system was still escalating containment. If it reached the final protocol tier, the entire tower would seal. Every floor, every corridor. Marcus exhaled slowly. Daniel noticed a shift in his posture. You know how to stop it. It wasn't a question. Marcus looked up at the flashing security map, then at Adrian Cross on the television screen, then finally at the CEO standing rigid in the middle of the corridor. I know how it works. Evelyn crossed her arms. Then start explaining. Marcus met her eyes calmly. That depends on what? He glanced once more at the screen, where the system logs continued scrolling faster and faster. On whether anyone here is ready to listen. For a moment, no one spoke. The quiet hum of the tower's machines filled the hallway, cooling fans whispering through hidden vents, electrical systems pulsing behind sealed walls. The monitors continued spilling lines of code across the glass display, like a language most of the room suddenly wished they understood. Evelyn Cross stared at the guard. You're in no position to negotiate. Marcus didn't react to the tone. He simply looked back at the security map where another red node had just appeared. Sector 27. The containment ring was tightening. Daniel Ortega stepped forward, voice low. Marcus, if you know something that could help, now's the time. Marcus glanced at him briefly. Daniel had always been fair with him, never treating him like the uniform meant he wasn't worth listening to. But fairness wasn't the same as trust. And right now, trust was the only currency that mattered. Another alarm chirped from the monitors. One of the engineers cursed again. Containment just expanded to the executive floors. Every head turned toward the television screen. Adrian Cross was no longer pacing. The boy now stood directly against the glass security barrier, looking down the corridor behind him. His reflection shimmered faintly in the reinforced panel as emergency lights began flashing overhead. He raised his phone again. Still no signal. A security officer on the opposite side of the sealed door spoke into a radio, frustration written across his face. The assistant near the monitor whispered, "He's trapped in the executive wing." Evelyn's posture stiffened. "How long until we open that door?" The engineer didn't answer immediately. Instead, he stared at the containment map. "If the lockdown keeps spreading, we may not." Silence fell over the hallway again. The CEO turned sharply toward Marcus. "You said you've seen systems like this before." "I have." "Then tell me how to override it." Marcus shook his head slightly. "You can't override it," Evelyn's patience snapped again. "This is my building, and the system protecting it doesn't care." One of the engineers leaned toward Marcus, studying him more carefully now. "What exactly do you think is happening?" Marcus gestured toward the scrolling log. "The migration server is issuing new authentication keys, while the executive panel is forcing legacy access commands." The technician frowned. So? "So the system thinks two different authorities are fighting for control." Daniel rubbed his jaw slowly. "And it treats that like a breach attempt." Marcus nodded. "That's how containment protocols work." Another metallic slam echoed somewhere below them. The floor vibrated faintly under their feet. Someone down the hallway swore under their breath. More doors sealing, more corridors cut off. The engineer stared at the map again. "It's moving faster now." Marcus studied the same display. Containment zones were forming a web across the tower's digital blueprint. Security nodes were isolating themselves, locking, reinforcing, defending. The building was protecting itself from its own operators. Daniel spoke carefully. How far does the containment protocol go? Marcus hesitated a moment before answering. That depends on what? He pointed to a blinking indicator near the center of the map. The threat level. The engineer followed his finger. The threat index was climbing. 2 bars, 3 bars, 4. The technician swallowed. What happens if it hits maximum? Marcus met his eyes. The building seals completely. Evelyn turned toward him. You're exaggerating. Marcus shook his head. No elevators, no corridor access, no external network connection. Daniel's voice dropped. That would trap everyone inside. Marcus nodded once. Until a manual reset, the engineer looked up sharply. Then let's trigger the reset. Marcus shook his head again. You can't. Why not? Because the core server room sealed itself first. The technician looked at his tablet again. He went pale. He's right. The CEO's voice hardened. Then we break the doors open. Marcus gave a quiet exhale. The doors are reinforced containment panels. They're designed to survive explosions. Daniel muttered something under his breath. The monitors beeped again. Another node sealed. Sector 25. Across the hallway, the television feed showed Adrian pacing again, anxiety growing with every passing minute. The boy tapped the glass. No response. No signal. No way out. Evelyn watched the screen for a long second. Then she turned back toward Marcus. Her voice was calmer now. Colder. You've been strangely accurate about everything happening in this system. Marcus didn't deny it. You've predicted every containment step. I understand the logic. One of the engineers spoke quietly. How? Marcus looked at the security map again. His gaze lingered on the spreading containment zones, patterns forming, exactly the way they were designed to, exactly the way they were supposed to. Daniel finally asked a question everyone else was starting to think. You didn't just see systems like this before. Marcus remained silent. Daniel continued. You knew what that red light meant before anyone else. Another alarm beeped. The threat level climbed another bar. The building's security system was approaching full lockdown. The facilities manager stepped closer. You knew the containment protocol before it even started. Marcus slowly lifted his eyes from the monitor wall. You're asking the wrong question, Daniel frowned. Then what's the right one? Marcus looked toward the screen showing Adrian trapped behind reinforced glass. Then back at the engineers. Then finally at Evelyn Cross. The question isn't how I know the system. His voice remained calm, steady, controlled. The question, he said quietly, is who built it. For a moment, no one in the hallway moved. The words didn't land like a dramatic revelation. They settled slowly, like a puzzle piece falling into place where no one expected it. Daniel Ortega blinked first. What do you mean, who built it? Marcus didn't answer immediately. His attention had shifted back to the security map, where the containment grid was tightening around the tower's center floors. Another node flashed red. Sector 22. The engineers stared at the screen, fingers hovering uncertainly above their controls. One of them turned slowly toward the guard. You're saying you know the architect? Marcus tilted his head slightly. I know how it was designed. The technician swallowed. That's not the same thing. Marcus didn't argue. Across the hallway, the television feed showed Adrian Cross pacing faster now. The boy knocked on the reinforced door again, frustration replacing confusion. A security officer outside the barrier tried his radio again. Nothing. Evelyn watched the screen, jaw tight. How long before the entire tower locks down? She asked without looking away. Marcus glanced at the threat index. Depends how fast the system thinks the breach is spreading. Give me a number. 10 minutes, maybe less. The hallway erupted into motion. Engineers rushed between terminals. Someone called the corporate security desk. Another technician tried routing emergency privileges through an external access server. Every attempt failed instantly. Access denied. Daniel stepped closer to Marcus again, voice low. If you understand the containment logic, there has to be a way to slow it. Marcus studied the scrolling logs. There is. Daniel's shoulders straightened. Then why haven't you said anything? Marcus looked toward the executive group standing behind Evelyn Cross. Because earlier I tried. The words were calm, but they carried weight. Several people shifted uncomfortably. Evelyn turned from the monitor, finally facing him fully. You warned me about the door. I did. And you're implying this entire situation could have been avoided? Marcus didn't answer. He simply looked back at the blinking security nodes. The silence said enough. One of the engineers stepped closer, curiosity overtaking irritation. You said the system ignores executive overrides during containment. Marcus nodded. Then what authority does it accept? Marcus pointed toward the system logs again. Architect-level access. The technician frowned. That credential doesn't exist anymore. The original design team left years ago. Marcus didn't respond. Daniel noticed the pause. You're not talking about a team. Marcus met his eyes. No. Another alarm beeped. Threat level rising again. 4 bars now. Containment accelerating. The engineer stared at the logs again, mind racing. Architect-level credentials would bypass containment routing. Marcus nodded. They would. Daniel looked between the guard and the monitors. You're telling me the only way to stop this system is someone who understands its architecture well enough to talk to it directly. Evelyn crossed her arms. And you conveniently know how. Marcus shrugged slightly. I know how it thinks. One of the technicians stared at him more closely now. You're not guessing any of this. No. Then how? The engineer stopped mid-sentence. Because Marcus had stepped closer to the monitor wall, not like someone observing, like someone recognizing something familiar. His eyes moved across the logs with quiet certainty, following patterns the engineers were still trying to interpret. Daniel whispered almost to himself, You didn't just work with systems like this. Marcus didn't deny it. The facilities manager looked back at the engineers. Pull the architectural documentation. One technician hesitated. That file's archived. Then unarchive it. Keys tapped rapidly. The system hesitated. Then a blueprint appeared on the screen beside the containment map. Layer after layer of security protocols filled the display. The engineer scrolled down to the design signature and froze. Wait, another technician leaned over his shoulder. What? The engineer pointed at the bottom of the file. A name. Daniel looked at Marcus slowly. Why does the architect's signature say? The floor vibrated again as another containment door sealed somewhere in the tower. The engineer read the line aloud. Lead Security Architecture, M. Hale. The room fell silent. Every pair of eyes turned toward the guard standing calmly beside the monitor wall. Marcus didn't look surprised. He didn't look proud either. He only watched the threat index climb another notch. 5 bars now, full lockdown approaching. Evelyn Cross stared at him. You built this system? Marcus spoke quietly. I helped design it. Daniel let out a slow breath. And you never thought to mention that? Marcus glanced at the blinking security nodes spreading across the map. I tried to. Across the hallway, Adrian Cross knocked harder on the reinforced glass. His voice couldn't reach them through the soundproof barrier. But the urgency in his movements was obvious. The CEO saw it too. For the first time since the crisis began, something shifted in her expression. Not arrogance, not anger, something closer to realization. Marcus finally stepped toward the main control console. If we're going to stop the containment cascade, the engineers leaned in. We need to start now, before the building decides no one gets out. And if you're still here watching this moment unfold, subscribe to the channel, because the quietest person in the room, he's about to take control of the entire tower. The room stayed frozen for a few seconds after Marcus stepped toward the main console. Engineers, executives, assistants, everyone seemed to be recalibrating their understanding of the quiet security guard standing in front of them. The same man they had laughed at minutes earlier. The same man whose name now sat at the bottom of the architectural blueprint glowing on the wall display. Daniel Ortega broke the silence first. "You're the architect," he said slowly. Marcus shook his head slightly. "One of them, but your signature is on the containment protocols." Marcus didn't argue. Another alarm pulsed through the hallway. The threat index climbed again, a harsh red bar flashing across the screen. 6 bars. The technician at the terminal swallowed. Containment escalation just accelerated. Marcus leaned over the console, scanning the system heartbeat logs. "It will keep accelerating until the network stabilizes, and if it doesn't?" one engineer asked. Marcus didn't look up. "Then the tower locks completely." That answer landed like a stone in still water. Across the hallway, Adrian Cross was still pacing behind the sealed security door, unaware that the system around him was tightening minute by minute. Evelyn Cross watched the screen, then slowly turned back toward Marcus. "You said you helped design this system," she said, voice colder now but controlled. "Yes." "Then you also designed a way to stop it." Marcus finally met her gaze. "I designed a way to prevent exactly what just happened. That's not the same thing." "No," he agreed quietly. "It isn't." Daniel stepped closer to the console. "What does the system need right now?" Marcus pointed toward the migration logs. "Authentication stabilization." One engineer frowned. "You mean cancel the migration?" Marcus shook his head. Too late for that. Another alarm beeped from the monitors. The security map flashed as another sector sealed. Sector 21. The containment ring was now closing around the building's core floors. Marcus rested one hand lightly on the console. "We have to convince the system the conflict is over." "How?" the engineer asked. Marcus gestured toward the architecture display. "The containment algorithm doesn't just react to commands. It watches behavioral patterns." The technician blinked. "You programmed pattern recognition into the lockdown system?" Marcus gave a small nod. "It predicts operator behavior." Daniel looked impressed despite the tension. "So the system thinks the building is under attack because commands are conflicting." "Exactly." The engineer frowned again. "Then we stop issuing commands." Marcus nodded slightly. "That's step 1. The technician removed his hands from the terminal immediately. Across the room, 2 other engineers did the same. For the first time since the alarm started, the control station grew still. Marcus studied the security map. The threat index hesitated. But it didn't drop. "Step 2, Marcus said quietly. Daniel folded his arms. "What's step 2? Marcus looked at the authentication channel running between the migration server and the executive override system. "We give the network a stable authority signal." The technician looked confused. "You mean like administrator access?" Marcus shook his head. "No." He pointed to a deeper command layer in the system architecture. "Architect-level confirmation." The engineer stared. "That credential was retired years ago." Marcus glanced at him. "The system doesn't know that." Silence fell again. Daniel's eyes widened slightly. "You're saying the system will still recognize the original architect?" Marcus didn't answer right away. Instead, he typed a short command into the console. The engineers leaned closer. The login window appeared. "Architect authentication required." The technician whispered, "That access channel still exists?" Marcus nodded once. "It always has to." Evelyn crossed the room slowly, heels clicking against the polished floor. "You designed a hidden authority channel inside my building." Marcus looked up. It wasn't hidden. It was documented. She glanced at the blueprint still glowing on the wall. Daniel rubbed his chin. Buried in 5,000 pages of technical architecture, Marcus allowed himself a faint smile. Most people stop reading after the executive summary. Another alarm chirped. 7 bars now on the threat index. The engineers exchanged nervous looks. Marcus's fingers hovered above the keyboard. "If I authenticate through this channel," he said quietly, "the system will recognize a single authority again." "And stop containment?" Daniel asked. "It should." "Should?" Evelyn repeated sharply. Marcus looked at the map. The red nodes were spreading faster now. "If we wait any longer, the system won't accept authentication from anyone." Across the hallway, Adrian knocked on the glass again. The sound couldn't reach them. But everyone saw the panic growing in his movements. Daniel looked back at Marcus. "Then do it." Marcus didn't type yet. Instead, he turned slowly toward Evelyn Cross. The CEO met his gaze, arms folded tightly. "You're waiting for something," she said. Marcus nodded. "Authorization." Her eyebrows lifted slightly. "You're asking permission to save the building you designed?" Marcus's voice remained calm. "I'm asking permission to take control of it." The room went quiet again. The threat index climbed another fraction. The building was seconds away from escalating into full lockdown. Evelyn Cross stared at the man she had mocked only minutes earlier. Then she exhaled slowly. "Fine," she said. "Fix it." Marcus turned back to the console. His fingers moved across the keyboard with quiet confidence. The login prompt blinked once, then waited. Architect authentication. Marcus began typing, and across the tower, thousands of sealed doors waited to see if the system would recognize the man who built them. Marcus's fingers hovered above the keyboard for a fraction of a second. The login prompt blinked patiently on the console screen. Architect authentication required. Behind him, the entire hallway seemed to hold its breath. Engineers leaned closer, executives stood motionless, and even the distant hum of the building's machinery felt quieter, as if the tower itself was waiting. He began typing. The keys clicked softly beneath his hands. A long authentication string appeared across the terminal, an old credential sequence that none of the current engineers had ever seen before. One of them whispered, "That's not a standard admin code." "No," Daniel murmured quietly. The code continued scrolling across the screen. It looked less like a password and more like a handshake between two systems that had known each other for a long time. Marcus pressed enter. The terminal paused. Processing. Across the wall monitors, the security map flickered once, then again. For a moment, nothing happened. The threat index remained frozen at 7 bars. One of the engineers shifted nervously. Did it. The terminal chimed. Architect access verified. Several people gasped. Marcus exhaled slowly. The system had recognized him. Lines of deeper system architecture unfolded across the console like doors opening inside doors. Hidden diagnostic channels appeared. Core security pathways that had been locked minutes earlier now responded. The technician beside him stared in disbelief. "I've never even seen these menus." Marcus gave a faint shrug. Most people weren't meant to. Behind him, Evelyn Cross watched the monitors carefully. "Can you stop the lockdown?" Marcus didn't answer right away. He was already studying the system's behavior patterns. The containment cascade hadn't stopped. It had only slowed. Red nodes were still spreading across the tower. But now he could see why. "The system still thinks the breach is active," Marcus said quietly. Daniel frowned. "But you just authenticated." "Yes, then why isn't it shutting down containment?" Marcus pointed to a line in the diagnostic feed. Because the conflict signal is still running. The engineers leaned closer. 2 authentication streams were still fighting inside the system. The migration server, and the executive override Evelyn had triggered earlier. The network still believed 2 authorities were battling for control. Marcus typed another command. The console opened a deeper system layer. Root conflict analysis. A complicated flow diagram appeared, mapping the argument happening inside the tower's digital brain. The technician blinked. The system thinks the override panel is an attacker. Marcus nodded. That's exactly what it thinks. Daniel folded his arms. So how do you convince it otherwise? Marcus studied the diagram. There are 2 ways. The room grew still again. What are they? Daniel asked. First option, Marcus said, I isolate the override signal completely. That sounds good, one engineer said quickly. Marcus shook his head. It would also isolate the executive wing network. The technician's face fell. That's where Adrian is. Marcus nodded. Exactly. Everyone turned toward the television screen again. The boy was now sitting on the floor beside the sealed door, frustration giving way to worry. Evelyn's voice was tight. What's the second option? Marcus looked back at the conflict diagram. I convinced the system the override signal belongs to the architect. Daniel blinked. You merge the signals. Marcus nodded slowly. That would stabilize the command structure. The engineer hesitated. But if it fails, Marcus finished the thought calmly. The system escalates directly to full lockdown. No more containment rings, no more partial access. The entire building would seal. Every floor, every corridor, every exit. The hallway went silent again. 7 bars still glowed on the threat index. One more escalation could push the tower past recovery. Evelyn stared at the map for several long seconds. Then she looked back at Marcus. You're telling me the building's security system thinks I'm the threat. Marcus met her eyes. You forced a command conflict during a migration. Her jaw tightened. That wasn't my question. No, Marcus said calmly. It wasn't. Daniel stepped closer. How confident are you the merge will work? Marcus studied the code. I designed the protocol. That's not what I asked. Marcus paused. Then he answered honestly. 80%. The engineers exchanged uneasy glances. 20% failure meant the entire tower could become a sealed vault. The red threat bar flickered again. 7 bars. Still rising. Marcus rested his hands on the console. The system's decision window is closing. Across the hall, Adrian stood up again and knocked weakly on the glass. The sound didn't reach them. But the urgency in his movements did. Evelyn watched her son for a long moment. Then she turned back toward the console. Her voice was quiet now. Do it. Marcus looked at her carefully. You're sure? She didn't hesitate this time. Yes, Marcus nodded once. Then he began typing the merge command. Deep inside the tower's security network, 2 authority signals moved toward each other. Either they would stabilize the system, or the building would lock forever. And every person in the hallway watched the console, waiting to see which one would happen. The command window blinked once. Then Marcus pressed enter. For a split second, nothing happened. The tower hummed around them, server turbines spinning beneath the floors, electrical relays whispering behind reinforced walls. On the monitor wall, the conflict diagram pulsed as 2 command streams began moving toward each other inside the system's core. Migration Server Authority. The Executive Overrides Authority, both racing toward the same control layer. One engineer leaned forward nervously. Is it merging? Marcus watched the diagnostic feed carefully. Not yet. The console began displaying a new line of system behavior. Authority validation in progress. The room went quiet again. Across the hallway, the television monitor still showed Adrian standing beside the sealed glass barrier. The boy looked exhausted now, shoulders slumped slightly as he tried once more to call someone on his phone. No signal, no response. Evelyn Cross didn't blink. Her eyes stayed locked on the console, where the guard stood calmly guiding the system she had built her empire inside. Daniel Ortega whispered beside him. "What's it doing?" Marcus pointed toward a column of code flashing on the screen. "The system is verifying the authority chain." The engineer frowned. "That shouldn't take long. It does when the architecture was designed to distrust human commands." The technician looked at him carefully. "You really thought about every possible mistake someone could make." Marcus gave a faint shrug. "Systems fail because people assume nothing will go wrong." A sudden tone rang from the console. One of the engineers jumped. "What was that?" Marcus read the notification. "Conflict escalation." The threat index on the security map flickered. 7 bars pulsed again. The building was still seconds away from escalating to full lockdown. The technician rubbed his forehead. Come on. Marcus leaned slightly closer to the screen. Inside the system logs, something new appeared. Architect signal verified. One authority channel had been accepted. But the conflict signal still remained. Daniel whispered. "Halfway." Marcus nodded. The second verification window opened. Executive signal analysis. The engineers exchanged glances. "That's her override command." Marcus nodded toward Evelyn. "The system still thinks it's hostile." The CEO crossed her arms tightly. Convince it otherwise. Marcus typed another sequence into the console. "What are you doing?" the engineer asked. "Tagging the override command with architect credentials." Daniel blinked. "You're essentially telling the system that the executive command came from you." Marcus finished typing. "Exactly." The technician stared at the code. "That's clever." Marcus didn't answer. He pressed enter again. The command executed. Across the monitor wall, the conflict diagram shifted. The 2 authority signals moved closer. The security system hesitated. Processing. Another alarm chirped somewhere deep inside the building. The threat index flickered. 7 bars. Still unstable. The hallway air felt heavier now, like pressure building before a storm. Daniel glanced toward the television screen again. Adrian had started pacing faster. Even through the silent camera feed, his anxiety was obvious. Evelyn's voice broke the tension. "How long?" Marcus didn't look away from the console. "Seconds." The engineers watched the diagnostic feed scrolling down the screen. Validation request sent. Command alignment in progress. Network stability recalculating. Then the console chimed again. A deeper sound this time. System authority recognized. The conflict diagram on the monitor wall snapped into a single clean line. 1 authority, 1 command structure. The technician gasped. "The conflict's gone." Marcus exhaled slowly. But the containment zones on the map were still glowing red. Daniel frowned. Why didn't the lockdown stop? Marcus was already typing again. "Because containment protocols don't reverse automatically," the engineer blinked. "You mean we still have to reopen every sector?" Marcus shook his head. "No." He pulled up the containment control layer. A command panel appeared. Containment release authorization. The technician stared. That menu wasn't visible earlier. It only appears when the system trusts the authority issuing commands. Marcus began typing again. Across the tower, thousands of sealed mechanisms waited. Security bolts, magnetic locks, reinforced corridor gates. The command field blinked. "Execute global release?" Marcus's finger hovered over the enter key. Daniel whispered beside him. "This is it." Evelyn stood directly behind them now. Open the building, Marcus glanced once more at the security map. Dozens of trapped employees, engineers, assistants, and one frightened teenager behind reinforced glass. He pressed enter. For half a second, the system paused. Then the console lit up. Global release confirmed. Across the skyscraper, the first containment door unlocked with a loud, metallic click. Then another. Then another. The security map began changing. Red nodes fading. Green pathways returning. Engineers stared at the screens in disbelief as the towers slowly breathed again. If this moment made your heart race even a little, subscribe to the channel now, because stories like this remind us something important. The person everyone ignored just saved everyone. Marcus leaned back from the console slightly as another wave of doors unlocked across the building. But he wasn't celebrating yet, because one sector on the map was still blinking red. The executive wing, where Adrian Cross was still trapped. And the system had one more command waiting for him to approve. The room had barely begun breathing again when Marcus noticed the blinking red node. Executive Wing, Sector 15. Every other containment zone on the tower map had faded from red to green. Corridors reopened. Elevators began resetting. Security doors across dozens of floors were unlocking one after another with heavy metallic clicks. But that single sector remained sealed. Marcus leaned closer to the screen. Daniel noticed immediately. "What is it?" Marcus pointed at the map. "That sector didn't release." The technician beside him frowned. That shouldn't happen if global release executed. Marcus pulled up the containment control log. A warning line flashed across the console. "Sector isolation active." The engineer read over his shoulder. Why would it isolate just that wing? Marcus scrolled further down the diagnostic feed. Because the system had logged something unusual seconds before the merge, a delayed containment command. Triggered from the executive override panel, his eyes moved slowly across the timestamp. The command had come from the same moment Evelyn Cross had overridden the system earlier. Daniel whispered, realization creeping into his voice. "The system thinks that sector is the source of the breach." Marcus nodded, exactly. Across the hallway, the television feed showed Adrian Cross still inside the executive corridor. The boy stood near the glass door watching the hallway nervously. Somewhere in the distance, a newly unlocked elevator chimed, but the door in front of Adrian remained sealed. Evelyn stepped forward sharply. "Why is that wing still locked?" Marcus turned slightly toward her. "Because the system thinks the attack started there," her eyes narrowed. "That's ridiculous," Marcus didn't argue. Instead, he pointed toward the log entry. "Your override command originated from that sector." Daniel looked between them slowly. "The system thinks the executive panel caused the breach." Marcus nodded. "It quarantined the area." One of the engineers stepped closer to the console. "Can't you just release it manually?" Marcus hesitated. "I could." The technician leaned forward hopefully. "Then do it." Marcus shook his head slightly. "It's not that simple." Evelyn's patience snapped again. "Explain." Marcus pulled up the sector control layer. A smaller containment diagram appeared. Unlike the rest of the tower, Sector 15 had entered something deeper. Quarantine mode. Daniel rubbed the back of his neck. "That sounds worse." Marcus nodded. "It is." The engineer read the system note. "Quarantine sectors require secondary verification." "Verification of what?" Daniel asked. Marcus pointed at the authorization requirement. "Breach source confirmation required." The technician blinked. "The system wants confirmation of the threat source before releasing the sector." Marcus nodded again. "That's how quarantine works." Evelyn stared at the screen. "Then confirm it." Marcus looked at her calmly. The system believes the threat source was the executive override command. The room went quiet. Daniel exhaled slowly. That command came from you. No one laughed this time. No one even spoke. The blinking red node continued pulsing on the map. Adrian was still trapped. Marcus rested his hands lightly on the console. To release that sector, he said carefully, "The system needs a command acknowledging the override caused the breach." Evelyn folded her arms. "You want me to admit that?" Marcus shrugged slightly. To the system, the engineer muttered under his breath, and everyone watching, because every monitor in the hallway still displayed the security logs, every engineer, every assistant, every executive who had watched the guard get mocked earlier, now they were watching something very different. Daniel spoke quietly. "It's just a confirmation command." Evelyn didn't answer. She stared at the blinking quarantine node where her son stood behind reinforced glass. Marcus waited. He didn't rush her, didn't pressure her. He simply watched the timer counting down beside the quarantine protocol. Because even that system had limits. If quarantine remained active too long, the sector would reseal itself permanently until a full manual reset could be performed, which could take hours. Adrian knocked on the glass again, this time harder. The silent camera feed showed the frustration in every movement. Marcus finally spoke again, voice calm. The system was designed to hold people safely during a breach. Evelyn looked at him. But it also requires accountability before it trusts new commands. Daniel glanced at the console timer. 2 minutes before quarantine hardlocks, Marcus nodded. The tower was quiet now except for the distant sounds of reopening doors. Everyone in the hallway waited, not for the system, but for Evelyn Cross. Finally, she stepped closer to the console. Her heels echoed softly against the polished floor. Marcus moved aside, giving her access to the keyboard. The confirmation prompt blinked on the screen. Breach source acknowledgement required. She stared at the command field for a long moment. Then she began typing. The engineers leaned forward. Daniel watched silently. Marcus said nothing. When she finished, she pressed enter. The system processed the command. A second later, the console chimed. Breach source confirmed, quarantine lifting. Across the hallway, the television monitor showed the reinforced door in front of Adrian unlocking with a loud metallic click. The boy looked up, confused, relieved. Then the door slowly slid open, and for the first time since the alarms began, the executive wing was free. But no one in the hallway was looking at the door anymore. They were all looking at Marcus. Noticed it immediately. Not the mocking glances from earlier, not the casual dismissal that came with a security uniform in a building filled with executives and engineers. These were different looks, recognition, awe, and something else that hadn't existed in the hallway before. Respect. Across the television monitor, Adrian Cross stepped cautiously through the now open security door. A security officer on the other side rushed forward, speaking quickly into a radio while guiding the teenager down the corridor. The boy looked confused but unharmed. A ripple of relieved murmurs spread through the room. Daniel Ortega leaned against the console with a slow exhale. "Well," he muttered, "that was about 10 minutes closer to disaster than I ever want to experience again." Marcus leaned back slightly from the keyboard. The containment map on the monitor wall had finally turned completely green. Every sector unlocked. Every corridor accessible again. The skyscraper's systems had stabilized. One of the engineers shook his head in disbelief. "I still can't believe the architect of this entire system was working night security." Marcus shrugged lightly. Life changes. Another technician leaned forward, scrolling through the security logs. "You designed a containment protocol strong enough to lock down 40 floors, and then built a hidden access channel to stop it." Marcus glanced at the screen. It wasn't hidden, the engineer smirked. Buried under 5,000 pages of documentation, Daniel chuckled quietly, which nobody read. The tension in the hallway slowly dissolved into nervous laughter. For the first time since the alarms began, the tower felt normal again. But Evelyn Cross wasn't laughing. She stood several steps behind the console, watching Marcus carefully. The engineers had begun discussing what had just happened, reviewing system behavior, analyzing the containment cascade, debating how close the tower had come to a full lockdown. But Evelyn's attention remained fixed on the quiet man who had just taken control of her entire building. "You left this industry," she said finally. Marcus turned slightly. "I did. Why?" He hesitated for a moment. Across the hallway, the television feed now showed Adrian being escorted toward an elevator. The boy looked shaken, but safe. Marcus watched the screen briefly. "My wife passed away," he said calmly. "Someone needed to stay home with my daughter." The room grew quieter again. Daniel looked down. One of the engineers shifted uncomfortably. Marcus didn't elaborate. He simply rested one hand on the console and studied the system status display to make sure everything remained stable. Evelyn stepped closer. "You walked away from designing global security architecture to work as a night guard." Marcus smiled faintly. "I needed a job with predictable hours." The honesty of the answer hung in the air. Daniel rubbed his chin slowly. "You know," he said, "when you predicted Sector 15 locking earlier, I should have realized something was different." Marcus glanced at him. "You were busy dealing with alarms." One of the engineers turned toward Evelyn. "Ma'am, the system logs show the containment protocol performed exactly as designed." She didn't respond. Another technician added carefully, "If the architect hadn't been here tonight, the building would have reached full lockdown." The implication hung heavily in the room. Marcus didn't comment. He was already typing quietly again, reviewing the final containment reports. Daniel looked over his shoulder. "What are you doing?" "Closing the conflict report." "You're filing the system event yourself?" Marcus nodded. "Someone has to explain why containment triggered." The facilities manager chuckled softly. "That report's going to be interesting." Marcus finished typing and saved the file. Across the tower, elevators resumed service. Hallway cameras showed employees cautiously returning to their workspaces. The skyscraper was alive again. Daniel stretched his arms slightly. "Well, crisis over." Marcus shook his head. "Almost." Daniel frowned. "What do you mean, almost?" Marcus gestured toward the system architecture file still open on the wall display. "There's still the matter of what caused the migration conflict." One of the engineers leaned closer. "You think it wasn't just the override command?" Marcus scrolled through the log timeline. The override started the containment. But something else triggered the authentication loop. Daniel raised an eyebrow. "You're saying this wasn't entirely human error?" Marcus pointed to a line in the code. "This signal shouldn't have existed during migration." The engineer's face tightened. "Where did it come from?" Marcus tapped the screen. "External network channel." The room went still again. Daniel whispered, "You mean someone outside the building tried to access the system?" Marcus nodded slowly. "That's exactly what it looks like." Evelyn's voice sharpened instantly. "Are you telling me someone attempted to breach Crosstech infrastructure tonight?" Marcus leaned back from the console. "Looks that way." The engineer stared at the screen. Then the containment protocol didn't just protect the building. Marcus nodded once. It protected everyone inside it. Daniel folded his arms, staring at the map again. So the system worked. Marcus allowed himself a small smile. Exactly the way it was supposed to. And for the first time that night, Evelyn Cross looked at the quiet man not as a guard, but as the person who had just proven he understood her entire empire better than anyone else in the room. The hallway stayed quiet long after Marcus finished explaining the final system log. No one laughed anymore. No one whispered jokes about a night guard giving instructions. Instead, engineers leaned toward the screens with renewed focus, tracing the external access signal Marcus had pointed out. One technician shook his head slowly. "He's right." Daniel looked over his shoulder. "About the breach?" The engineer nodded. There was an outside authentication request during the migration window. Another technician joined them, and it tried to piggyback on the executive override channel. Daniel let out a slow whistle. So someone tried to slip into the system while everyone was distracted. Marcus nodded calmly. That's the most likely scenario. Across the tower, the containment doors were now fully open. Employees moved cautiously through hallways again, unaware how close they had come to being sealed inside a steel fortress. The skyscraper had returned to normal, but the atmosphere in the executive corridor had changed permanently. Evelyn Cross stepped toward the monitor wall. "Trace it." The engineers began working immediately. Marcus remained beside the console, arms resting loosely on the edge of the desk. His eyes followed the diagnostic feed as the system reconstructed the attempted intrusion. Daniel leaned beside him. "You're saying the lockdown actually stopped a breach?" Marcus nodded. The containment system isolated the network before the attacker could escalate access. The engineer looked up from the terminal. Whoever it was lost their connection the second containment triggered. Evelyn crossed her arms. "So my system saved the company?" Marcus gave a small shrug. "Our system." The correction landed quietly. For a moment, the CEO didn't respond. Instead, she stared at the blueprint still displayed on the monitor wall. At the bottom of the architectural file, Marcus's name remained visible. Lead Security Architecture, M. Hale. Daniel noticed her staring. "You know," he said carefully, "there's something funny about tonight." Evelyn glanced at him. "Oh?" He nodded toward Marcus. The only person in this entire building who understood what was happening, he paused, was the one person everyone ignored. Several engineers exchanged glances. The technician at the terminal chuckled softly. "That's usually how these stories go." Marcus smiled faintly but didn't comment. He was still studying the system logs, making sure the breach attempt had fully disconnected. After a moment, he closed the diagnostic window. "All external channels are locked down now," the engineer exhaled. "Good." Daniel straightened slightly. "So the tower's safe?" Marcus nodded. "Yes." The facilities manager clapped him lightly on the shoulder. "Not bad for a security guard." Marcus chuckled. "Just doing my job." Across the hallway, the elevator doors opened. Adrian Cross stepped out, escorted by a security officer. The teenager spotted his mother immediately. "Mom." Evelyn moved toward him quickly, tension finally breaking from her posture as she placed a hand on his shoulder. "You all right?" "Yeah, the doors just suddenly opened." The boy glanced around the hallway. "What happened?" Evelyn hesitated for a moment. Then she looked toward Marcus. Adrian followed her gaze. The guard stood quietly beside the console, finishing the final system shutdown procedures. "That man," Evelyn said slowly, "fixed the problem." The teenager looked surprised. "Him?" Marcus gave a polite nod. "Hey," Adrian offered a grateful smile. "Thanks, I guess." Marcus shrugged lightly. "Happy you're safe." Daniel leaned back against the console, watching the exchange. "You know," he muttered to one of the engineers, 10 minutes ago everyone in this hallway thought he was just a guard who didn't know when to keep quiet." The technician laughed. "And now?" Daniel gestured toward the monitor wall. "Now half the building owes him their evening." Marcus finished the last system command and closed the console window. The control room lights dimmed back to normal mode. Crisis officially over. Evelyn walked slowly back toward him. The hallway grew quiet again as executives and engineers noticed her approach. She stopped a few feet away from Marcus. For a long moment, she didn't say anything. Then she looked toward the blueprint on the monitor wall one more time. Lead Security Architecture, M. Hale. You built the backbone of this building, she said finally. Marcus shook his head slightly. A team did, but your protocol saved it tonight. Marcus shrugged again. It did what it was designed to do. Evelyn studied him for a moment longer. You warned me before the override. Marcus nodded. I did. And if I had listened. He finished the sentence calmly. The containment wouldn't have triggered. The hallway remained silent. Finally, Evelyn Cross extended her hand, not like a CEO addressing an employee, like one professional acknowledging another. Marcus looked at the hand briefly, then shook it. The room erupted in quiet applause from the engineers and staff who had witnessed the entire night unfold. And for the first time since Marcus Hale started working in the building, no one in that hallway saw him as just a security guard anymore. The quiet applause faded slowly through the hallway. Not loud, not dramatic, just the sound of people realizing something important all at once. Marcus released Evelyn's hand and stepped back toward the console, already reaching to shut down the final system monitors. To him, the crisis was finished. System stabilized, logs archived, security channels sealed, work done. But the room wasn't ready to move on yet. Engineers were still watching him like they had just discovered a secret hidden in plain sight. Daniel Ortega leaned against the console with a small grin. You know, he said, most people get introduced to a company with a handshake and a business card. Marcus raised an eyebrow. Yeah? Daniel gestured toward the tower around them. You got introduced by locking down 40 floors. A few engineers laughed. Marcus chuckled quietly. Technically, the system did that. But you designed the system, one of the technicians pointed out. Marcus shrugged. Years ago, across the hallway, Adrian Cross stood beside his mother, still looking slightly overwhelmed by everything that had happened. The teenager walked over to Marcus again. So, you really built this whole security thing? Marcus smiled faintly. Part of it. Adrian shook his head in disbelief. And you work night security? Marcus leaned casually against the console. Turns out buildings still need someone watching the doors. Daniel laughed. Understatement of the year, Evelyn Cross remained quiet for a moment, watching the exchange. Then she spoke. You walked away from designing global infrastructure to raise your daughter. Marcus nodded. That was the job that mattered. For the first time all night, the CEO smiled slightly. Daniel looked between them. You know what tonight proved? The engineers turned toward him. He pointed toward Marcus. The smartest person in the room isn't always the one standing at the front. One of the technicians added, sometimes it's the one everyone ignored. Marcus glanced toward the lobby security cameras on the monitor wall. On one screen, Lily Hale sat in the lobby reading a book, waiting patiently like she had done 100 times before. He smiled. Speaking of important jobs, someone's probably wondering where her ride home is. Daniel followed his gaze. That your daughter? Marcus nodded. Yeah, Evelyn noticed the screen too. She was here during all of this? Marcus shrugged lightly. She's used to the building. Daniel chuckled. Well, after tonight, the building's going to know her name too. Marcus shut down the final console window and picked up his old travel mug from the edge of the desk. The engineers slowly returned to their terminals. The hallway lights returned fully to normal. The skyscraper had settled back into the rhythm of a regular evening. But something had changed. The quiet security guard walking toward the elevator wasn't invisible anymore. Daniel called after him. "Hey." Marcus turned slightly. "Yeah?" The facilities manager smiled. "Next time the building starts acting weird, maybe mention earlier that you designed the thing." Marcus laughed softly. "Fair point." He stepped into the elevator and pressed the lobby button. As the doors slid closed, the last thing he saw was the group of engineers still talking about the system he had built, and the CEO watching thoughtfully from across the corridor. A few moments later, the elevator opened in the lobby. Lily looked up from her book immediately. "Dad?" Marcus smiled as she ran over. "Sorry I'm late. Work again?" Something like that. She slipped her small hand into his. "Did you fix it?" Marcus looked back toward the towering glass building stretching dozens of floors above them. "Yeah," he said softly. "I think we did." They stepped out into the night together. And inside the tower behind them, hundreds of employees would eventually hear the story about the quiet single dad who told a CEO to step back, right before saving the entire building. And now, I want to hear from you. Ask me for the next story title you want to see. Subscribe, and don't miss our next story. The janitor told the surgeon to stop. Seconds later, the operating room fell silent. Trust me, you'll feel it. And tell me in the comments, what injustice should we tackle next?